So, oh, thank you. Yes, I should be recording that. You're recording this, Joe. You're a gem. Thank you, Joe. Um, I'm living on in a colonized country, so in the spirit of reconciliation, I acknowledge the traditional owners of country, not only here in Kuparuna Nyara, the mountains of our spirits, in English, the Great Western Tiers, Halatore country in the central north of Tasmania, but from all of the traditional owners and custodians of lands, where all of us gather to meet this evening, to be together. I acknowledge continuing contributions to land, waters, and cultures, and further acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and I also pay my respects to those who were not able to attain elder status. Myself and my business, Gentle Death Education and Planning, support the treaty movement. Anyone this evening who recognizes, who identifies, as Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander, thank you for being here. This is a safe space for everyone, and you are very welcome. I'm really happy for questions. I'm really happy to have you reference my work, but please don't go nicking stuff and then claiming it as your own. I've had some plagiarism in the last couple of years, and it really sucks. So, end-of-life doulas and assisted dying, you will see AD and VAD interchangeably throughout this presentation. If we were in North America, so the USA or Canada, we would see MAID, M-A-I-D, medical assistance in dying. And if you're in Switzerland, it's referred to as euthanasia. So language can change, but that's okay. There's good reasons for that, and we'll be taking a look at that. So as Jess said, I'm many things. Something that doesn't necessarily go into my bio, but you kind of need to know it for this, is that on the academic side of things, I'm an invited guest lecturer. I used to be a regular academic lecturer. Now I mostly do end-of-life, grief, death, and dying, and I may be the only person who shows up to a university course of 3 or 4 years length who actually talks about death and dying. So generally I get a lot of questions. And I'm also a social researcher. So that means I go out and I listen to people and I write down what they tell me. So some of what will be going on tonight is an outcome of some original research that I've done too. So bear with me. I'll try not to fall into academic wank speak because that's not fun for anybody. First of all, you may be very, very death positive and death oriented, but you may not know exactly what an end-of-life doula is, also known as a death doula. In some parts of the world, Canada, for example, you can say death midwife if you've been trained by Pastor Mary Moon, although that's a little bit contentious, but we don't say death midwife in Australia because midwife is a medicalized term. You are a nurse who has had particular specialist ongoing training, and you cannot call yourself a midwife unless you have that training. So there's this kind of appropriated, possibly Greek, possibly not word, doula, that means servant or slave, depending on the translation. But according to some birth doulas in Greece, it's actually an appropriated word, and English speakers are using it incorrectly, and they think it's very strange. Essentially a doula, whether you are at the birth transition or the death transition. I've done both. Birth isn't my jam. I really like the other one. I like end of life. I'm far better at that. It is a non-medical support and advocacy person, or a role. An end-of-life doula works with the dying and their support networks. So that might be providing education, providing witness, providing presence, supporting people with advanced planning, preparation. Sometimes I'm a witness to documents, for example. We can sit with the dying. We can offer information and support to those around the person who is dying, or a combination of both. We work in homes, we work in hospitals, there are some end-of-life doulas who are particularly interested in working with the homeless, or working with migrant and disenfranchised groups. So end-of-life doulas work in a variety of spaces, including online. I actually do a fair whack of work online. So there's a little bit of an idea that you have to be working face-to-face and in person. You don't. And some of the resistance to the term doula, which is kind of a foreign term. So EOLD is actually, for some people, more comfortable than saying death doula or end-of-life doula, is because the A at the end equates it to being a feminine term. And in fact, this is a space where women, non-binary persons, trans persons, and people who identify as male are all very welcome and needed. I don't know about you, but I know some gay men who fundamentally aren't very comfortable around women, would prefer the company of men, and the last thing they're going to want when they're dying is a woman around them doing stuff. So there is room in this arena for all kinds of identities. And one of my favorite things about this festival actually is the embracing and normalcy of diversity of identity, because we do need that in the death space. The beauty of having a non-medical role when you are dying, thinking about assisted dying in particular, since this is a talk about VAD, is that, sorry, I've just had a brain fog moment. I looked down at the chat and lost my train of thought, excuse me, is that people can bounce ideas off of you. It's very easy for us to say, I don't know, but I will find out. Whereas a medical person, a doctor, perhaps even a nurse of some standing, might be reluctant to say they don't know or they aren't sure, because surety is the hallmark of the medical practice. We essentially have a system where doctors are gods, and unfortunately, we've put them in an untenable position where death is a failure. And I'm really pleased to see the opening up of assisted dying really gaining traction around the world, because we need to take that pressure away from doctors for a start, because everything dies. The universe will one day die. Ask Professor Brian Cox. He'll wax at length about the heat death of the universe. Everything and everyone dies. It's a natural part of life, so we don't need to keep denying it. And this is one area where it can actually be wonderful to talk to an end-of-life doula, because we're not tied to the whole, oh, no, it'll be fine. You'll be fine. You'll be up and running around tomorrow. Rather than just like, well, I don't know. It might be this or it might be that. And what do you want? What do you feel? What do you think? So being able to normalize end of life and lead community and individuals in that aspect of death literacy can be very, very reassuring for people, especially when in assisted dying, there's that agency and that choice. So my death is going to be Thursday and it's probably going to be sometime early in the afternoon. Well, okay, what do we need to get you to that point so you're comfortable and you feel that everything that you need to do has been done? Okay. So what is assisted dying? There's an awful lot of misinformation and disinformation around assisted dying. And most of that, I have to be honest, and they may not be very palatable for some people, but all the evidence demonstrates that this is what it is. It is an entrenched religious privilege position, that the only person who can decide when any of us die is insert name of God here. Now, that's fine if that's your belief, but you don't get to tell anybody else that we all have to behave that way or think that way too. The important thing to remember about assisted dying, no matter which country you are in, no matter which framework, legal-medical, which means the intersection of legislation and medical practice, legal-medical, you must request. It is opt-in. If you're not interested in assisted dying or it would offend your God, don't ask for it. It really is as simple as that. No matter where you are in the world, no matter which legal-medical framework you're operating under, you must meet certain criteria. And the number one of those is you must be deemed of sound mind, competent, to make the request. So this is where dementia is a bit of a sticking point for a lot of people who work in the assisted dying space. So we just had a big conference. I didn't go because on a note of transparency, my mother died earlier this year. We're at week 28, so just over 6 months ago. And this grief has been quite powerful for me. And I took some time out, so I haven't been conferencing very much this year, i.e. at all. And some other stuff happened, including long COVID. But there was the first annual Australia New Zealand Assisted Dying Conference. And one of the most urgent things that came out of that, two big things. Number one is being able to talk about assisted dying on the phone. State legislation may allow for that, but there's still an outmoded federal legislation that means you can be charged with criminally for using a carriage service, telephone provider, carriage service, to discuss assisted dying because the legislation's outmoded. The other thing was we need to have a pathway to assisted dying in some cases for dementia, because once you have any form of dementia diagnosis, at the moment, you are not eligible to apply for assisted dying. So we actually, in all cases, have a good deal of oversight. There are oversight committees. There are quite detailed and specific bureaucratic and administrative processes that pharmacists go through to send out medications and to retrieve them, that doctors have to go through, that the health system has to go through. And then everything is examined. Every single event is examined. So an assisted death is called an event. And also be aware that there is a small but significant percentage of people, and this is a global statistic, who will receive their lethal medication and then choose not to take it at end of life. They will actually be comfortable simply having the choice and end up not dying in an assisted way and be perfectly comfortable with that choice. So assisted dying is an opt-in medical legal process offering choice to people who have terminal or life-limiting diagnosis. And you can die with dignity at a time and sometimes place of one's choice. Now, the reason sometimes place is some countries, like the Netherlands, for example, you cannot die at home. You go into the hospital and it's administered. In some places, you can't administer for yourself. Here in Tasmania, where I live, there's 4 different options. Everything from at home by yourself, which is never a choice that I recommend for my clients when I work with them, by the way, because if they do that and they drop their I can't pick it up for them. Family member can't pick it up for them. That would actually lay us open to criminal charges around that death. So with assistance is good, but with assistance might be someone in the room, someone administering for you, or you can go into a hospital and be in, if you are more comfortable in a medicalized environment. So depending on where you live, names may change. So we have VAD, voluntary assisted dying in Australia. Assisted dying is another one that you'll see. Medical aid in dying, other versions, as I said. Okay, so let's bust some myths. I had some fun on social media doing a whole bunch of myth busting with an ETA series. VAD is not suicide. First off the bat. Suicide is a fairly emotional knee-jerk reaction phrase that gets thrown around a lot. Here in Tasmania, we have groundbreaking legislation that's been taken up around the world where there's an action where your choice is life and death. Assisted dying is the clear choice between death and death. And that's been a game changer to have that actually articulated as a legal framework in the legislation. So a lot of hysteria around, oh, you can't do this, is, oh, you're assisting suicide. And the problem with emotional language and emotional attempts at argument is you're actually dealing with a misframing that is about feeling rather than about fact. The exception to this is Switzerland, and it's a little bit trickier because the actual language in the Swiss law, which dates back to 1933, so it's 90 years old, is that it is euthanasia. And euthanasia and suicide often are linked in terms of, oh, this is bad, and there's historical reasons for that around the Nazis. I'll get into that in a little bit. But the Swiss legislation, after 90 years, they're not going to change their terminology. Switzerland is also interesting in that it is illegal to help someone to die if you have a personal gain. So you can't do it for money, you can't do it for profit, but it is not illegal to sell someone the means to end their own life, which is why we have organizations like Dignitas and Final Exit who can help foreign nationals to die. So Switzerland is the only country in the world where you can go as a foreign national, a non-Swiss citizen, to end your own life legally under Swiss law. Mind you, it's going to cost you $20,000 to join Dignitas or one of the other newer assisted dying organizations, and you have to buy a return ticket because death tourism, they kind of keep an eye out for that. So the language in Switzerland is exceptional, but also the legislation in Switzerland is exceptional. As more and more countries adopt assisted dying, it becomes less problematic for end-of-life doulas who may wish to accompany a client to Switzerland, and then it might be problematic when you come home again. People with disabilities under assisted dying are not targeted. So there's quite a famous pair of twins, Mark and Eddie, in the Netherlands, who had been born deaf, profoundly deaf. And they had some other physical difficulties, and they'd lived their entire lives together. They repaired shoes, they had a business together. And as their life progressed, both of them began to lose eyesight. One was considerably sicker than the other, but neither of them was in great health. And they applied together as twins, two individuals together, to have assisted dying so that they could die as they had lived. They were born together, they lived together, and they met all of the criteria and died together, because to be deaf and blind and with other health challenges, they determined was too much for them. Mark and Eddie are frequently trotted out by generally religious extremists who talk about the twins. They wouldn't actually use their names, about how they were targeted by the system and isn't it awful, and people with disabilities are being killed open slather. Interestingly enough, assisted dying helps to stop non-consensual deaths because it's very well vetted, it is transparent, there's a lot of oversight, and you have to request it. So the whole fallacious, which means it's made up, fallacious argument of the slippery slope, it's not a thing. In any country with assisted dying, we don't suddenly see people with disabilities being targeted. There is genuine concern amongst some sectors of disability community members and disability advocates that people with disabilities will be targeted. And this is based in essentially a white supremacist, colonizing Christo-fascist pseudo-science called eugenics. And in a nutshell, this has been something that's been Hitler and the Nazi Party, they used eugenics a lot to justify murdering people who had physical and intellectual disabilities, who were not white and not Christian. So there is historical precedence, and this is when we get to looking at what's happening internationally, bear in mind that for Germany, this is something that is really affecting the medical community in terms of lack of progress for assisted dying. But the reality is that under VAD, people with disabilities are not targeted. And about 10% of VAD recipients can also donate their organs. So the lethal medication that you take doesn't actually impact your organs. The trade-off is that you can't die at home. You need to die in a hospital right next to a surgical ward so they can get right in and take relevant organs. Covered the slippery slope. And keep calm, don't believe the hype, and help to educate and inform as many people who might be willing to listen to you in order to stop the myths around VAD. Where do end-of-life doulas and VAD intersect? Well, end-of-life doulas can be support people, not just for the person at end of life, but also for the people around them. Death literacy, the reclaiming of the knowledge and understanding of what the body goes through when we die, how people might respond when someone is dying or when they've died. How does your local health system work? Because it varies from state to state. What's going on? What kind of funeral directors do you have? All of this information. There's a really nice up spiral that happens between death literacy and compassionate communities. The stronger your compassionate communities, the better your death literacy. The better your death literacy, the stronger your compassionate communities become. It's a win-win for everybody. End-of-life doulas can also be sounding boards. We're not in any way telling people what to do, but if someone wants to talk about something, we can be a listening presence. We can be a willing ear. We can also give people silence, which perhaps friends, families, colleagues, neighbors might be more reluctant to do. Because silence, if you're a well-rounded, well-trained and experienced death worker, you understand how powerful silence is. We can simply be present, because that in and of itself can be a gift. And coordinators of support networks, because sometimes it's easier to bring in an expert as just someone from out of town. So having an end-of-life doula come in and go, okay, yes, there's all of these relationships going on amongst the family, but I'm not involved with that. So we're just going to get things sorted. So that can be incredibly helpful too. Sometimes it's just about admin and logistics. Language matters. You've heard me say death and dying a lot, and you've heard death, dying, dead quite a lot at this festival. Anytime someone says to me, we lost them, my very first impulse is to ask them, did you check the fridge? Losing people, it sort of implies their GPS has gone offline, but they'll be coming back around in about 10 minutes. Passed over? They passed. They took a test, or did they die? Using, in a very normal tone of voice and in a matter-of-fact kind of way, the language of death, dying, dead can be a huge relief for people. And when someone particularly is contemplating assisted dying, or a good friend or a family member or someone you work with is going to undertake assisted dying, or is going to at least try and see if they qualify, that can bring up a lot of mixed emotions for people, because there's no way around facing your mortality. Language helps. By not being euphemistic, by not pussyfooting around, by not saying we're pushing up the daisies. If you're not sure what I mean by this, there's a wonderful Monty Python sketch called the Dead Parrot sketch. John Cleese quite famously bangs the parrot on the desk. There's all sorts of euphemisms and jokes about being dead. Watch that. It's a wonderful example of, yes, how to say the right thing, but don't go banging parrots on desks at your clients or their friends and family. Having conversations, encouraging people to have conversations. Lots of end-of-life doulas host death cafes, or like me, run planning events. So people actually get their heads around the basic documents that can help take the stress and strain away from the people close to them. when they're at end of life or when they die. Language can help people be calm about their planning, to realize actually it's not that difficult, but it's important. So the way that we phrase and frame and normalize end of life, death and dying, and talking about, well, I've been Catholic my whole life, for example, but I'm thinking about reincarnation. Okay, well, what do you think? What are you thinking about? People come to me and have conversations that they couldn't necessarily have with their grandparent or their child or their sister or spouse or their priest, because I am in a non-medical neutral role in that respect. So the language that I use being very normalized, that encourages all sorts of good death literacy and opens the door to a lot of conversations. Gotta say though, if you want to have really successful conversations, bring biscuits or cake, sweeten people's way. Cup of tea, biscuit. It also gives people something to do with their hands. Very helpful. Humans get a bit nervous waving their hands around. Also, you know, if you aren't quite sure what to say, see what I did there? I just bought myself a few seconds to think. A cup of tea and a slice of cake does wonders in conjunction with really good language. Death literacy is an Australian term coined by Dr. Kerry Noonan while she was undertaking her PhD. And it helps foster and build community. End-of-life doulas in general are people with very high death literacy. So we're actually assets in our communities and in our neighborhoods. Sit down with an end-of-life doula sometime and have a chat. And better still, get a small group of them. I keep trying to come up with a collective noun for end-of-life doulas. I'm not sure. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it's an intelligence or a compassion of end-of-life doulas. We'll see. Okay, so this is the research side of things, and this is a piece of research that is actually free. It's an open access journal. That means anyone can download it and read it, and it's not going to cost you any money. And usually academic articles start at about $40 and up. So I made a very conscious choice to make the Malin model, and that's it there. Intimate role, gatekeeper role, peripheral role, the starter's guide, everything is in that that article. If someone would please remind my little long COVID brain to put the link up when I finish speaking, I will do that. It's a micro model of a compassionate community for home-based care. And essentially it came out of research into end-of-life doulas. And one thing I noticed is that everyone I spoke to had their own way of setting up a system of supporting someone who wanted to die at home or organizing the people around someone who was dying. But it wasn't standardized and it wasn't easily replicable. So I developed something that is, and you can do it with as few as 3 people and up. Carer burnout is minimized. So the main focus at this stage was not only standardizing end-of-life doula work, but also trying to minimize and help eliminate carer burnout, especially primary carer burnout, which is a global public health problem. It also works for other home-based care situations, including disability support and physical rehabilitation and recovery. This model is ideal for assisted dying, whether that's in a medicalized environment or at home, because it gives everyone around the person who is, oh, thank you, Catherine. There's the link on my website. Thank you, Catherine. You can also go to Sage Journals. It's, by the way, this is helpful. This article has been downloaded over 4,160 times. I checked earlier in the week. So please feel free. This is great because it can actually help bring family, friends, neighbors, colleagues, members of your church group, members of your gym, whoever your posses are in all of your communities. Everyone can actually fulfill a role. and feel that they've contributed up to their comfort level and in ways that suit everyone. So assisted dying at home doesn't have to be a flurry. It can be as well organized and as joyous and as good a death as the person would want. And we can avoid carer burnout on the way through, which is great. So assisted dying internationally. How am I doing on time? Okay, good. Right. Switzerland, nationals and foreign nationals can go there to die. I have talked about this. The downside to Switzerland, though, is that you're not at home and you might be lonely and you may not have been able to tell people goodbye before you go, depending on the country that you're in. In Europe, this is far more common in many countries. So in Belgium and the Netherlands, we're looking at quite some time in terms of data, in terms of events. It's also useful to remember that often the legislation reflects the social and cultural mores and norms of the different countries that you're living in. So, for example, in the Netherlands, you don't GP hop the way we do here in Australia, where doctors may come and go, or I live in a state with basically really poor healthcare. It's Tasmania, I think for the last 23 years, has come bottom of the charts in Australia in terms of healthcare availability. We literally fly in and fly out nurses from Western Australia and other parts of the country. We have people who live on islands, like King Island, for example, where the doctors fly in and fly out, which is why our legislation has registered nurses being able to administer lethal doses if people don't want to self-administer or can't self-administer, because that filled a need. This is why telehealth is also very important, because Australia is, you may not have seen it on a map, people, but it's big. And we have huge distances sometimes between patients and doctors. Now, Belgium and the Netherlands, very, very small countries. And the doctor you start your life with may well be the doctor you end your life with, which is why the local, your personal doctor is deemed to be the most fit person to administer your lethal medication, because they know you best. So bear in mind that part of the reason assisted dying can be complex and diverse is because approaches to medical care and how we think about doctors and trust in doctors can vary wildly. Just FYI, Mike Gaffney, the member of the upper house in Tasmania that successfully carried the voluntary assisted dying bill through, the one who wrote the bit about suicide not being like assisted dying, had registered nurses being able to give final doses, because some people had said to him, language alert. And he listened, went, okay, what about nurses? No, nurses are fine. Okay. There's also in Canberra at the moment, the ACT, the Australian Capital Territory, for anyone who's not here in Australia, they're actually drafting legislation that would allow registered nurses to be able to put people into the assisted dying process. So actually being able to assess people. So again, it's about accessibility and making this process as accessible as possible should you meet all the criteria. In Canada, it's very much like Australia, where we've got it, medical assistance in dying happens across the country, but depends which province you live in. So things can vary. In the USA, it's very bitsy-piecey. For a country with well over 350 million people, the stuff that happens at county, let alone at state or federal level, can be eye-watering. So there can be quite big differences between states, but Oregon, which has had the longest assisted dying laws in the USA, they've got some sensible legislation built in. You can't have moved there in the last I think 6 months to a year, you kind of changed your will for a certain period of time. So there's protection for people trying to get in your good graces, get you to sign everything over to you, and then you get them to travel so that you can profit from their death. In Australia, this is now, we're looking basically at every single state and soon to be both territories. In a neat piece of irony, the Northern Territory was the first place in the world to have assisted dying laws. And some religious conservative fanatics in federal parliament used a loophole where federal parliament can override territory law under the Australian legal system, still can. And after 6 months and only 4 events, they declared that assisted dying wasn't legal. And the Northern Territory will be the last place in Australia to get it back. But it also means that they're probably going to have the most robust and effective and progressive legislation because they've been able to learn from every state and the ACT on the way through. Now, we've also got assisted dying that is in progress. So Italy and Germany, I think, are quite interesting, although Argentina, hi Cora, also has legislation, but it's written in such a way that you can't really access it, and it's made it too difficult. Now, what we've got in Germany is the shadow of the Nazi Party rearing up again, and technically under the law in Germany, assisted dying is legal, but the way that it's worded, that's open to interpretation. And every single doctor has gone, yeah, no. We want to be sure that we are protected and will not be charged with doing anything criminal because we understand the ramifications of eugenics. We understand how important it is to do everything correctly and appropriately. So you can go to your doctor and say, I'd like this medication. And they'll go, yes, and legally we can give it to you, but I'm not writing the prescription. That's the state of play in Germany. Italy has a similar kind of stalemate, and as with a few other countries from memory, where it kind of is bouncing back and forth between levels of legal approval. And sometimes it is the president that bounces stuff back. Sometimes it's different levels of parliament. So there's kind of interesting fly, no fly zones that are happening in several countries at the moment. And it's a little bit difficult to stay on top of that because that can be subject to change quite rapidly. Again, hysterical language and emotional non-arguments being the last bastion of poorly informed people. Keep calm and don't believe the hype. A lot of countries in the process of assisted dying discussions are facing that. So let's talk about the UK. Because in terms of poorly informed people, interestingly, an overwhelmingly, startlingly high percentage of people, it's about 80% from the polls that have been taken, of people in the UK support access to assisted dying. Bear in mind, that doesn't mean that everybody who supports it would want to access it. There's a significant proportion of people that say, you know, it's not something I'd ever want for myself. I personally wouldn't choose that, but I think it's important to have that choice. What's the sticking point in the UK primarily is quite reactionary religious individuals who happen to occupy positions of political power. So you've got a system where not everybody in parliament is elected. You might just be sitting in there because you've got a particular religious position. So you're a bishop. And there's a lot of pontification going on about, well, no, we can't because God. And I'm an atheist. So I personally think that a separation of church and state is a very, very sensible thing. What happens in the privacy of one's own head, or if you're so inclined, the privacy of one's own heart in terms of what you believe, that's fine. But it has absolutely no place in law. So I reread a 2017 report that came out in the UK about essentially how the British legal system was funding Dignitas because people are undertaking death tourism to go to Switzerland. And unfortunately, what was happening, and this has backed off quite a bit, but people who would come back after supporting their person going to Dignitas might actually be faced with police at the airport, or police showing up at their door shortly after they got back, and they take them in for questioning with regard to being an accessory to murder. What's helpful is that quite significant power blocks in the UK are now backing away from this. So the British Medical Association has softened their stance and said, actually, we don't think that assisted dying is a criminal act, so we're not going to censor or censure any of our practitioners who support that. So that was a really big step forward that I think has happened in the last year or two. The other thing about death tourism to Switzerland is this is a bastion for the wealthy and the privileged. Continuing a theme that has actually, I've heard from a few different speakers here at the festival this year. You also have to be able-bodied, so there's ableism involved. Because in Switzerland with assisted dying, excuse me, drinking problem, spilled my water, you have to be able to self-administer. What this means for some people with wasting diseases like MS or ALS is that if you're traveling to Switzerland for death tourism reasons and you meet the criteria, you can't just rock up at Dignitas, by the way, and say, hi, I'm here, I'd like my medication and my piece of chocolate, please. You do have to go through a process of being assessed by 2 independent doctors, just like everywhere else in the world. And there's a period of time that just like everywhere else in the world. It's not like you get it on the day. I was listening to one of the moderating actually one of the presenters yesterday who's in Colorado, and that's a 15-day period. Here in Australia, the average is 10, but I was actually working with someone whose best friend had very, very aggressive glioblastoma. And they fast-tracked her, and she was approved in 4.5 days. She met all the criteria, and every single step was ticked. But I'm relieved to know that the system is so good after a year here in Tasmania that they can speed it up on compassionate grounds when they need to, and everything still works okay. If you go to Dignitas or assisted dying in Switzerland, you'll be in a home-like environment. Dignitas has a house where they can accommodate up to 2 events at a time. It's like a duplex, but it's in an industrial zone. So it's a home-ish like environment, but you are in an industrial zone because of what's actually physically happening. So it is not your home. You won't be able to have all your people around you. Exit International is piloting a virtual reality pod for a nitrous death, which takes about 30 seconds. And the whole idea of that is that it's mobile and you can take it around and be in the place that you'd like to be. But you're not at home, and you may also be quite lonely. There's some things coming up in the chat about In Love by Amy Bloom is the true story of taking her husband to Dignitas. Yep. So Terry Pratchett and his assistant Rob also followed a couple of people who had gone to Dignitas in Switzerland. And that documentary, whose name I cannot remember at the moment, is also well worth seeing. So I've covered all of that there. So how can end-of-life doulas help when there's assisted dying? As well-informed death literacy advocates, end-of-life doulas can talk to their communities, help support pro-choice legislation and movements in articulate and calm and rational ways. So alongside the more micro and intimate support and education we can provide, there's also the capacity to give more widespread, accurate information and myth busting. So festivals and events in our local states and communities, festivals and events that happen to be global in scope. Thank you, Joe and Victoria. Haley was just talking, contact Haley. She's a radio show host. There's podcasters out there, there's media, and social media platforms, either your own or work together with someone. We started the festival with Beck Lambert and Jess Harkins, who are Unashamedly Six, working together. One is a social media manager and community manager, and the other is a graphic designer. They have incredible stuff out there. And so there are people you can hire to help you as well. A lot of what I've been doing, my experience has been, I'm doing a lot of stuff, rapid delivery education for family and friends who are acting as doulas on what to expect. So the woman in Tasmania who was fast-tracked recently, that was the best lifelong friend of a very, very dear friend of mine. So I drove the length of the state to sit with her in a park for about 2 hours and give her the lowdown on how assisted dying works in Tasmania, what they could probably expect, and how urgent it was because, of course, with brain tumors that are moving really fast, your competency could be deemed to be cut off at any time. But also about the physical process, ways to coordinate the family as a community. And she also read the Mellon model and found that incredibly helpful. Julia, yes, I've just gotten a direct message from Julia, and yes, it's being recorded. Yes. I also, so the sort of one-on-one doulaing the doula, the nascent doula, information about the bureaucratic side of things to help families, friends, and community members better understand how assisted dying works. So I've been to a presentation by the VAD committee talking about how the pharmaceuticals are transported. So here in Tasmania, it all comes just from the dispensary in the Royal Hobart Hospital, and it's direct courier in and out. So we don't have multiple places. That will probably come in the fullness of time, but for now, oversight is centralized. People find that really reassuring. It just doesn't magically come through Australia Post. There's a start and an end. Knowledge is power, and helping people understand the process that's not all about their person is really helpful, incredible. And then they're going to share that and tell other people. So another win-win. Myth busting, we need to do a lot of it still, unfortunately. So, rumors and the exaggerated run rampant. It's really good to be able to say, no, actually, that doesn't happen at all. But it is really interesting. Let me tell you this. Myth busting can be fun. Debriefing. I do a lot of debriefing and aftercare support and presence for those who may still be wrapping their heads and hearts and minds around the assisted dying process, the event itself. And often that's about actually not having huge emotions. Sometimes that's the thing that people need to process, that their person was okay with their death. They were okay with their person making the decision that they'd made. Okay, so what am I feeling? So sometimes it's part of that. And I'm very grateful that I have over 30 years of experience as a therapist, because sometimes I need that. I do a lot of mentoring and supervising. So talking to people here in Australia and also overseas about assisted dying. People might have their own ethical wrangling around that, or they might have some questions, or they might wonder how things happened here in Australia. So I can give them pointers to how they can find out more. I do spend a lot of time saying, I don't know, but I will find out, or we'll find out together. As well as mentoring and supervising people who are themselves working with people undertaking VAD. Something else I'm really good at, and I don't think we talk about enough, is that networking people together. So if you really want a doula, a death doula, to be with you in the moment, great. I know a bunch of people, and I know of people who run different networks. And I know some incredible practitioners. So I refer people on and network people together. And that's a particular strength of mine, and I quite enjoy that. So that is me. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm so sorry. The first thing that I've seen here is Tamsin said my grandma in England was desperate for it and wasn't able to get it. And I'm so sorry that that you and your family had that experience, Tamsin.
I'm just
so Jess,
yes.
How do you want to do this? Shall we run through questions together, or
First
do you
thing
want
I'm
me
going
to
to do while I remember is just put all your links in so that we know, so that everybody's got that. And I'm also going to put in all the names of all the books for you.
Fabulous. Okay, let me find.
So that's all the links, and these are all the books and documentaries and all of those things. I think that's everything I wanted to put in. I've got a few things. I've written down all the things that I thought would be quite good to go over.
Okay. My little COVID. Oh, that stuff is there. Okay, I'm gonna want the books too. Let me find the Mellon model on Sage as well.
I'll let you do that, and then I'll go ahead with the questions. If anybody feels like putting on their camera, that's always good, but fine if you don't feel like it. The model, the link.
We can't all be deaf literacy, Barbie.
No. Can you put in your link to the Mellon model? You did ask us to remind.
Yes, I've just put that in. So if you click on that link, and then you can just download the PDF from that.
Yeah. Okay. And then the other thing was Tamsin shared some really important things. I didn't know whether Tamsin might want to respond. Ah, there you are. Great.
Yes, and the Persis also has, so Tamsin, then Persis.
Great.
Yep, if that's okay.
To reply to Tamsin, did you want to reply? Yeah, great.
I can't remember exactly what I was
talking
about. I've like absorbed so much information from Annette, and now it's
okay.
Now I've lost my stuff.
I made a note for you. So it's about your grandmother, actually.
Yeah.
How much you wanted it all to, she was desperate, but it wasn't allowed in the UK. That was so I wanted to thank you for sharing that.
It was super hard on my mum, unfortunately, and obviously for my grandma, because my mum lives here and my grandma was she lived in Totton in Southampton, Hampshire, and it was actually she had a stroke and like a blood clot in her brain, and it left her paralyzed, like semi-paralyzed. She couldn't speak, things like that. And so for about 17 years, she was like stockpiling drugs and planning suicide attempts and, trying to jump in front of trains and stuff, just because, it wasn't legal to get voluntary assisted dying in England at the time, or where she was in England. And she ended up eventually in a home, because she wasn't able to take care of herself anymore. And she ended up just not eating or drinking. But I think it took about 15, 16 days before she finally died. And I think that's, what really bothered my mum. But amazingly, I think it was nearly the same, I think it was a year later or something like that. My husband's grandma did the same thing here in Australia. And it was before voluntary assisted dying was legal here in Victoria. And she did the same thing, but she was much quicker. So she stopped eating and drinking, like by choice, and it took about 8 days for her to pass away. But she was like more like, it wasn't such a long drawn out thing for her. She was more sort of like, oh, I've had enough, I'm just going to do this now. Whereas my grandma was more sort of fighting for it. She got that. Oh, sorry, no.
No, I was just going to say I'm looking for them, but my bookshelves are a little bit all over the shop at the moment. But Andrew Denton, who was the front-facing spokesperson for Go Gentle Australia, which was the movement to get assisted dying legalized in Australia, spoke to so many people. And one of his books actually just documents quotes from people whose beloved ones had experiences like yours. They watched someone dying of bowel cancer, or they watched people have the most horrific, protracted, drawn out deaths where people did not want to be in their bodies anymore. And why assisted dying can be compassionate, and compassion that was desperately needed. And every time I hear stories, I've put the Terry Pratchett documentary in there. Like, excuse me just a moment. You're going to be looking at my screen for a second.
That's
I'm
okay.
not sure.
In the meantime, I'll just let Persis know. Persis, I'll come to you next, and then Hazel, who's just off screen at the minute.
Yeah. If you go Gentle Australia, because it's a national thing, and you look for Andrew Denton's books, he's sort of stepped down from that role, and they've got, I think, Dr. Linda Swan as their CEO now, but they're worthwhile having. If not, just email me. Let me put my email. Andrew Denton, yes.
So thank you so
There's
much.
my email address, and I will send you the information. Persis. Sorry,
That's
Jess.
good. Then you can get in touch.
Thank you.
And then Persis, and then I'll come to you, Hazel, because I know you had some interesting things.
Yeah, I have some. Oh no, I'm just going to take my hand down, lower hand. There we go. You're such a great advocate for assisted dying, and it's been really, really interesting for me to listen to the talk. But I have some. I'm just not so comfortable with it. I have a strong Buddhist background, and it's kind of that thing about avoiding suffering in life and avoiding suffering in the dying process, avoiding being a burden to others, like people's motivations. There's a lot there for me around really.
So I would ask you to gently think about why the fetishization of suffering is so important in Buddhist belief.
Well, I wouldn't say that it is, but I mean, like what you were saying just now about people not wanting to be in their bodies anymore. And there's, like people not wanting to be in their bodies. But actually, why not? I mean, for me, it's more about advocating for better palliative care and actual care for people. And that
do you know what the percentage is? Sorry, do you know what the percentage is of people in palliative care where pain medication does absolutely nothing? Because palliative care will tell you we've sorted all pain, which is a lie.
I don't think it's just about the pain medication, but it's about alleviating people's mental suffering. So being surrounded by kindness and compassion is also, it's there's some. I'm not
the ultimate kindness.
I don't think, I'm not.
No, these are genuine ethical concerns.
Yeah,
these are genuine ethical concerns, and I would say that based on where you are with your own ethical conundrum internally, assisted dying might not ever be a choice that's right for you, and that's okay. And it's important that that choice is supported. And by the way, something I didn't put into my slides, but I do want to emphasize, is not all end-of-life doulas want to work in assisted dying. And we need to and the International End-of-Life Doula Research Group that I'm a founding member of, we agreed very early on that actually we need to have just as much space and support for practitioners who don't, for whatever reason, don't want to be involved with assisted dying, in the same way that doctors who don't want to participate, they shouldn't withhold information from people, but that needs to be respected too. So for those of you who are wondering, it's at least 5% of people, pain medication doesn't touch the sides. If you are wondering about why people might not want to be in their bodies, I think it's compassion. My response would be, I think it's compassionate and kind to listen to what people want. And have you ever been around someone who is living with terminal bowel cancer?
No.
Okay, so you end up defecating, so you're shitting through your mouth at the end. I don't think that there's anything noble about glorifying suffering or say we have to go through that for the sake of it. Personally, myself, I have something called hyperenervation, so I have more nerve endings than usual. I really am a sensitive flower, people. So pain medication for me is a little bit fraught, because sometimes medical practitioners don't, I don't necessarily want pain medication when I go home from the hospital, but when I've been in the hospital in the moment, I need more. Like dentists are a little bit afraid of me because it takes twice the amount of anesthetic to numb my mouth. So I think, Persis, your perspective is a very interesting one. And I guess I'd like to say to you, I hope that you've perhaps eventually come to a point where you find some balance for you, like you reach a point where
Yeah, well, I mean, I think I do
you can
have some
encompass.
balance.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely not opposed. And in fact, I'm probably a supporter in the sense that what people are driven to avoid that suffering, if medical assisted dying is not available, is really tragic. You know, the not having access, or the having to self-medicate, or the having to kill a partner because you can't bear to see them suffer anymore. You read these
Or you try and
stories,
jump in front of a train.
and yeah, and so yeah, so for me, medical assisted dying is better, but it doesn't, yeah, it's just like there's no perfect answer.
And I think that palliative care and assisted dying have to go together, and end of life doulas and palliative care work really well together. So there's a really nice intersection there.
Thank you.
Persis, I want to thank you. I want to thank you because it's not always easy to say, well, but I think this, especially when you've got someone who's quite a confident public speaker like me. So thank you. And thank you for sharing your truth and your perspective.
Thank you so much. This is so fascinating. So I'm read out your comment, Hazel. So due to my voluntary work, I meet a lot of people with ALS or MND. A lot of them consider assisted dying, and some go through with it. They usually say their motive is because they don't want to be a burden, and the disease renders people 100% paralyzed and unable to speak. I cared for my hubby with the disease for 18 months, and he discounted assisted dying. Thanks so much, Hazel, for that, you know, for trusting us with that.
There's actually a really interesting Australian documentary, and I want to say it's With the End in Mind, but I may have the name wrong. And the man concerned was a real advocate, and he went toe to toe with some really entrenched, like, Christian religious bigots who were like, no, all the hysteria. And then at the end, he elected not to take the medication, and active dying, final act of dying, it can be anywhere from a few hours to about 48 hours, and he was doing Duchenne breathing and not really conscious for a couple of days, and that was his choice. So again, it's about choice all the way up to the end. And this is too where an end-of-life doula can be a wonderful companion and support, because respecting someone's choice when you think you know the way it's going to go can sometimes be really hard on friends and family. Watching the work of dying can be really exhausting and can cause a lot of questions and second guessing to come up. So end-of-life doulas can be really helpful there as well. I'm
so sorry to be the baddie here, but I've got to wrap things up for everybody. We've already had a little bit of an extra treat.
No, thank you so much.
So if you want to take a screenshot of the chat, all of you, please do. And I'm going to get you all into the meeting room again. But I just want to take an opportunity to thank you, Annetta, for such an incredibly informative talk. I mean, I knew almost nothing about it, and I work in this industry, so that's interesting in itself. There's so many little nuggets, fascinating nuggets, and it is such an interesting conversation, and I just wanted to thank you for opening that conversation for all of us. It's really a really fantastic thing to have done. Thank you, everybody. I'm going to put you in the meeting room.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Annette.
Thank you, Jess.
Thank you, everyone. Yes, thank you, Jess. I'll give you a hand putting people in the waiting room. Sorry, it means they sort of jump around a bit.
Yeah, there you go. Good. Well, topic. It was great. I think people really enjoyed it. I think they were fascinated. Yeah. Wow. You must have spent a lot of time learning about it.
I've had an interest in assisted dying for a long time. I'm an advocate of choice, informed choice.
Mhm.
I've been an advocate for assisted dying for a long time, and you know, it's in the International End of Life Doula Research Group. That's my thing.
Yeah.
I'm
that's
sort of like the group
something
expert, and that's my thing. Yeah.
amazing. All the
Oh,
different countries
everything
and
you never
countries.
wanted to know about assisted dying, but were forced to find